This video is now in session, and today we're going to be focusing once again on the influences of Asian Americans, both East Asian and Southeast Asian Americans, in our political system. So, in this video, we're going to talk about prior elections where Asian Americans have been heavily influential, and how we're a group that's starting to become more active in the political discourse, as well as a group that should be definitely taken notice by both the Democratic and the Republican Party. So we're going to start by talking about elections in Virginia. Usually I start from the West. I usually always treat California first, but California is interesting, which we'll cover at the end of this video. But Virginia is a state that has had heavy Democratic influences, or heavy Asian American influences. Now, before the 2008 election, where Barack Obama was elected by 365 electoral votes, Virginia was a constant Republican state, practically a reliable Republican state. In 2004 and 2000, George W. Bush won Virginia by likely margins, meaning he won Virginia by over 5 percentage points. In 1996 and 1992, Bill Clinton, who won landslides in these elections, was not able to win Virginia. And obviously Reagan was a complete Reagan is a special case, but even if we go before Reagan's era, we see in Jimmy Carter's year in 1976, he won every single state surrounding Virginia, but he was not able to win Virginia itself. Gerald Ford won it by 1.3 percentage points. Now this all changed in the 2008 election, where Barack Obama was able to win by 6.3 percentage points, which was a double-digit flip from when Bush won it by 8.2%. So why did this happen? It's because of the Fairfax suburbs, Fairfax County, which is right next to Washington, D.C., that started flipping from Republican to Democratic. And a lot of this was from the Asian American influences, where there was a fast-growing population of individuals living in the Fairfax suburbs who were Asian American. So these voters turned out for the first time in 2008 to vote for Barack Obama, and thus Virginia became a Democratic state, and it still is a Democratic state today, where we see in 2018, one of the only remaining Virginia districts that are left in the Fairfax suburbs went from Republican to Democratic. So Barbara Comstock, the Republican incumbent, lost in 2018 to Jennifer Wexton, and Jennifer Wexton won again, partially because of the Asian American vote in 2020, where part of her district surrounds the Fairfax County. And you can see that in other districts, Democrats won by very large margins, by practically 50%, which is a very, very high margin. So obviously, it shows a growth of Asian Americans in the Fairfax area, but it also shows that that Asian Americans helped flip several districts and a state to become Democratic. Now, there's a caveat to this, and there will be a caveat to this when we reach to California, which is that unlike other minority populations, the Asian Americans don't reliably vote for Democrats. In fact, there are a lot of Asian Americans who have conservative values and who vote Republican. And we see a foreplay into this with Thomas O. being the Republican challenger. But we'll see this again in California when we get to it at the end of this video. So that's one state where Democrats have been influential. Another state, Georgia. Georgia, a very recent influential state. And a lot of this is because of the Asian American population. Obviously, there's a lot of attribution that should go to Democrats flipping Georgia in 2020, including Stacey Abrams, the Georgia suburb vote, and as well as the Black American vote. But Asian Americans help propel Democrats to have a plurality win in Georgia, where Biden was only able to win by a couple thousand votes. Had Asian Americans not voted in Georgia in the 2020 election, then Georgia would have probably went for Republicans. We see here that that Georgia was also influential. That Asian Americans were also influential in the House races. In the 2020 election, Democrats were able to flip Georgia's 7th district, one of the only flips that they've had in the 2020 House elections, where Carolyn Bourdeaux won by lean margins by more than 2 percentage points. And part of that is because of the Asian American vote. Obviously, I'm biased because I myself am an Asian American, so there's a conflict of interest there, but this is all objective and this is all just based on prior elections. In Georgia's 6th district, it was flipped from Republican to Democratic in the 2018 election by Lucy McBath, and this is where a lot of the Asian American vote is concentrated in the northern Atlanta suburbs. So that's just another state where Asian Americans have propelled Democrats to win in a conservative state. Now, Asian Americans have not only been influential in voting for elections, but we've also been influential in electing Asian Americans to Congress, and this is most notably shown in Hawaii as well as California and Illinois. We'll get to California later, but in Hawaii, it elected the first Chinese American to Congress, Hiram Fong, who was a Republican, by the way, where he was elected to Congress. And currently, Hawaii has an Asian American senator, one of the only Asian American senators left today in Congress. So Hawaii has currently Mazie Hirono, a Japanese American, who was elected to Hawaii by her constituents. But also there's Illinois with the first Thai Chinese American, Tammy Duckworth, who was elected and flipped the seat from Mark Kirk in the 2016 Senate election in Illinois. Now, obviously, this was practically a pick-me-up seat for Democrats because Illinois is a very Democratic state. But nonetheless, it does show that Asian Americans are having both an influential impact, both in who they vote for, but also being in the political stage themselves, ourselves. So we still have a long way to go in terms of electing Asian Americans to Congress, but we're getting there at least. We're getting to that closer to that point where we can have the same amount of representation as we do in the United States, where we still have not a insignificant chunk of the population is made up of Southeast and East Asian Americans. Minnesota, another influential state for Asian Americans, where Asian Americans were able to have Minnesota stay Democratic throughout all of these years. Even as the Rust Belt has turned more Republican, the Asian American vote in Minnesota was Democratic, and as a result, Minnesota stayed Democratic in the 2016 election, where Clinton won by 1.5 percentage points, and the same demographic voted for Biden in the 2020 election, where Biden won by 7.1 percentage points. So it's once again another state where Asian Americans have had large influence on how elections go, either Democratic or Republican. Nevada, the same thing applies, where in the 2008 election, Barack Obama was able to flip it with the help of the Asian American and the Hispanic American vote in Nevada. So these two states are a continuing example similar to Virginia. And Texas is an example where Asian Americans have a lot of opportunities to make this state very influential. Now, at this point, it shouldn't be a surprise for us to be covering Texas again. Texas, we zealously cover Texas just because its changes, it's very interesting to cover in terms of the demographic changes and the political changes that has been happening in Texas. But Asian Americans have had a very large influence in a lot of these changes, particularly in Harris County and Dallas County, Tarrant County, Denton County, and as well as Collin County. So that means the Houston area and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And in both of these areas, there's a high concentration of Asian American votes that voted for Democrats in 2018 and in 2020, which helped propel Texas to become more democratic. And in the 2020 election, Biden was able to win it by 5.5 percentage, or he was able to narrowly lose it by 5.6 percentage points. So in the 2018 election, where we had the House elections up, if we zoom in, because Texas's House seats are uncharacteristically gerrymandered compared to other states, we see that Lizzie Fletcher was able to win by 52.5 percentage points. And part of this congressional district includes very heavy Asian population in Sugar Land. Sugar Land is where it has a high percentage of Asian Americans, and they turned out in 2018 to vote for Fletcher. The same thing happened in 2020, where Asian Americans helped keep Lizzie Fletcher in Congress, even with a flip in other Houston suburbs from Democratic in 2018 to Republican in 2020. The same thing happened in Dallas, where in 2018 Colin Allred dethroned Pete Sessions. Pete Sessions used to be he was the Republican incumbent, and he won in previous elections by very large margins. But here, where there's a high concentration of Asian Americans, which is right here in Plano, as well as Richardson, and as well as Garland, which have a high percentage of Asian American votes, they helped propel the state to vote for Democrats in 2018 and in 2020. And then in the 2020 election, there was a very competitive race in the Dallas suburbs between Beth Randoon and Candice Valenzuela. Now, while Democrats lost this race by a very narrow margin, Democrats were nonetheless able to narrow the margin from the 2018 and the 2016 election, partly because of the Asian American vote that was located in Southlake, as well as Euless and Coppell, Texas. Coppell, Texas especially has a high amount of Asian American voters. So that's Texas, but now finally we have California, and California is most interesting because it shows an example of how Asian Americans don't always vote for Democrats, but not only that, California has a combination of voting for Asian Americans into Congress, but also having Asian Americans be a very influential voter group in the state. So in California, there are multiple Asian American congressional congressmen and women who were elected, and an example of that is California's 17th district, which is in the San Jose area, where Volcana, a progressive, was able to win by particularly large margins. Even though this is definitely, obviously, a safe Democratic seat, it has been expanded in terms of its Democratic influence. And in the Southern California region, particularly in Orange County, Asian Americans have had a heavy influence in just the past few recent elections of whether these seats should be going for Democrats or for Republicans. In 2018, Asian Americans were the reason why Democrats won California's 39th district and California's 48th district for Holly Voda, as well as Gil Cisneros. But in the same district in the 2020 election, they were also the reason why Republicans were able to flip these seats from Democratic to Republican, where Young Kim and Michelle Steele were able to win. Both of them Korean American congresswomen who were elected to Congress, and one of the only Korean American Congress people in general ever. So it's a growth that we're seeing in terms of Asian American influence, and this growth will keep happening. Our demographic is growing in other states besides the states listed right here, North Carolina and Colorado. These states are growing in terms of Asian American populations, and in Alaska. Alaska is a very particularly interesting state to watch because of its increase in Asian American population, but also because Alaska, as a result of that, and because of that, has become more and more democratic. and you can watch our video on why Alaska will turn purple in a couple elections. So even though we're still not a huge force in politics, we are becoming a bigger force that should definitely be considered by Republicans and Democrats, and our votes are definitely not to be taken for granted, as shown by California. But ultimately, by voting, especially for Asian Americans, by voting for either Democrats or Republicans, you're sending a message that you want to be represented in Congress and you want your voice to have representation. And by doing that, your wishes will be granted. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.